All right, hello everybody, and welcome back to Test Tubes and Cauldrons, a podcast where we talk about the intersection of science and spirituality. This week, we're going to take a bit of a breather since the last couple episodes we've been pretty information heavy and talk about some random spiritual shower thoughts that we and some of our good friends have had. Fair warning, it's going to get a little weird, but hopefully you enjoy these with us. If you have any weird kind of shower thoughts that you had yourself, feel free to put them down below. If this is like a really popular episode, we might do a part two. We probably will do a part two just because I'm sure we'll have more as we go along. We can talk about some of those then. But before we get into that, let's do our what happened on this day. And actually, quite a bit happened on this day. It is currently April 25th. So we'll just kind of like go through all of them, I guess. Okay, I have to talk about this one because I actually got to go see the original publication, the original journal article of Francis and Crick's publication of the structure of DNA. And that happened actually on this day in 1953. Francis and Crick published the structure of DNA in the Nature Journal. But it is important to acknowledge our dear friend Rosalind here, who was a female scientist that actually provided the X-ray crystallography data that Francis and Crick utilized to construct their model of DNA. So she also plays a very important role and definitely should have been part of that Nobel Prize award being given out. But that happened in 1959 on April 25th. We had the first AIDS patient, which is really unfortunate. But thankfully, over the years, we've had a lot of fantastic work being done on AIDS, which has led to a good number of ways to help treat it and make it at least help people survive, even if they contract it. In 1990, on April 25th, the Hubble Space Telescope was launched and deployed in space from the Space Shuttle Discovery into an orbit 381 miles above Earth. Oh, the other thing that happened is that we had the birth of Wolfgang Pauli in 1900, and that was a quantum physicist responsible for the Pauli exclusion principle. And that essentially states that in an atom, there's no two electrons that can occupy the same quantum state simultaneously. Basically, it relates the quantum theory to the observed properties of an atom. And incidentally, Pauli has also had dealings with Carl Jung, and as such has some dealings with the occult as well. We'll put a link to an article there that can give you some more information if you're curious about it. But yeah, lots of cool stuff. This is honestly one of my favorite things to research. You just get to go through and like look at all the cool stuff that happened on what feels like very random days. Okay, let's get into spiritual shower thoughts. I'm so excited about this episode because we have some random stuff on here. All right, so the first one, do bacteria have spirits and can you work with them? What's everybody think?
I'm going to go for a strong yes. And I am biased because obviously I work as a microbiologist. But hear me out. So you can obviously state bacteria are definitely alive, more so than viruses are. And they've had a really massive impact on our world, like not just on human populations, because we depend on them for food, for plant growth, but they can even cause like terraforming, they can alter the states of minerals, they can affect the landscape itself. They predate gods that we have for other things. So, for example, Demeter is the goddess related to things like harvest, but we had bacteria before we had agriculture. And finally, most importantly, they are culturally important. So we have things that are very important to pagans, such as bread. Who could argue, like, what is more important to pagans than bread?
We literally
And
have like
beer.
a whole the Wiccas like on the Wheel of the Year, right? There's like a whole Sabbath dedicated to bread. Like
Exactly. And those are heavily dependent on microbes, bacteria, and yeast. So, in my opinion, yeah, they're really culturally important. And I don't see a reason why we couldn't work with them. But I just think because they're in a grouping, maybe you'd have to work with like the entire community. What do you guys think?
I love this. So like in my laboratory, I do a lot of work with like protein purification. And when we purify a protein and we make it in large quantities, we often use bacteria to do so. And because of this, like I do see bacteria as like living organisms. I mean, they are living organisms. Like by the classical biological definition, they are living. And so because of that, like, yes, you could say that they do have the spirit. I've never actually thought of it in that way. And when I saw this on the outline, I was like, that's wild. Like, I would have never considered this. But yeah, I do think that they have a spirit. What would be really interesting, though, is to talk about whether they have a spirit similar to I don't know, say like a plant or humans, or is it even more different, right? Because like they're microbes and they're so small, and the way that they function is very different than even a plant or an animal. Like their cellular build itself is incredibly different. For people who don't know, most bacterial like prokaryotic organisms, they don't have membranes. And so like their DNA, for instance, isn't actually encapsulated into a nuclear membrane. They don't have membrane bound organelles, all of these things that are very different. And so I'd be curious to know if there's any difference like on a spiritual level that kind of reflects those differences. Are their spirits maybe a little more unorganized and chaotic, given how like quickly they split and can also replicate? Yeah, I don't know. What do you think? Fel, do you have any thoughts?
I would just be curious as to what would working with a bacteria look like. I guess would be my thing. So if you bring up like working with bacteria, that then begs the question, what does one hope to do when you work with anything, I guess? The spirit and an animistic perspective, what are you hoping to engage just on like a grander scale? So that would be my question, is what would you think that the bacteria would do for you, if that makes sense? Or not would do, but like what would be the point of working with it? Would be my follow-up question to that.
I have something to say about this. So you may know that bacteria actually outnumber human cells in the human body. The estimate of this maybe varies. So it used to be, they used to say it was like 10 to 1. Nowadays they kind of say it's more like 3 to 1, and it's quite hard to estimate. But there is this idea, and it's a little bit controversial, that bacteria can actually alter our mental health. And the idea is that our microbiome can process foods and they can produce neurotransmitters in our gut. And those neurotransmitters can signal through our vagus nerve up to our brains. So they can produce, for example, serotonin in our gut, which can signal to our brains. So you could argue that actually we're able to change our mental state, and we're able to maybe self-love spells, for example, or even things to take us into a kind of ritual trance-like state through our gut microbiome. So that's maybe one example of something we could do. Or I don't know. I think there are lots of potential applications, but we have to work with them as like a population. So it's a bit different to working with like a singular organism.
That's really interesting, actually. And you could even combine that maybe with like kitchen witchcraft, right? And you could eat things that maybe like would produce like that are good and healthy for you and might produce like have the base chemicals for like functional neurotransmitters, and then work with the spirits of your gut microbiome to like, even if it's something as simple as better like absorption or better like translation, maybe to take it from this state into making like helping you feel better. I also think you could use it because like the other thing is that bacteria, there's so many different kinds, right? Like even within the microbe realm, like you have like soil bacteria, you have just like you have like disease bacteria. There's so many kinds. If you ever take like a microbiology class, it's a little disturbing to learn how many kinds there are. But like if you were working with like soil bacteria, you could use that in agriculture, right? Like if you're working with a garden, maybe working with the spirits of the bacteria in the soil, you could do things like help things grow, or like help keep the soil constant and like well fertilized and all of these things.
I'm full of follow-up questions today, I guess. So then my question is, so if you're working with the bacteria as a group, what would then make that different from working with the organism itself?
Because they're very, very short lived. Because they
Right.
have a lifespan which is very, very short. So if you were working, like they have a doubling time, for example, I think E. coli's doubling time is like 20 minutes. So basically their population goes up and up and up, and it doubles and doubles and doubles until you have kind of saturation where they use up all their nutrients and then they die off. So you would only have that time period until they run out of nutrients before your working stops. Unless you think that there are bacterial ghosts everywhere. But that just complicates matters, because then our world would just be completely overrun with
In a way,
microbes. So I
actually,
don't
you
know.
could use that cycle of growth to maybe have like a really quick representation of like a cycle. So for instance, like we know that the moon phase, we have like the waxing and waning phases and the full and the new moons, and they each have very specific uses. Could you utilize maybe the bacterial like the growth curve, where you have the like the log phase, then you have the stationary phase, and then you have the death phase? If you could maybe use that as like a shorter life cycle in a particular working. Like say you maybe only want a spell to go for 20 minutes, but you want to kind of hit all stages. You could maybe utilize the bacterial life cycle in that particular way. Again, you could just like grab some soil outside and you would have plenty of bacteria that could like help you with that. That's a really interesting thought. That's not something I ever considered.
That's interesting then, because then one could make the case that when you're working with plants, for example, that you could almost, it's like, people say like when you're, I don't know, working with plants or doing a spell that involves plants, that if you're working with cinnamon, tell the cinnamon to do one thing. You don't want to tell it to do multiple things. But by that certain logic, technically, I guess you could tell the different cells in whatever the plant, like if it's a plant that comes from the soil, you could tell the plant to do one thing and then the bacteria on the soil to do another.
It's really interesting, actually, if you also think about it, like, energetically speaking, because if anybody's ever grown bacteria on like on a plate in the laboratory, when we see like those little like the dots on the agar plate, they're colonies, and these colonies are full of thousands upon millions of actual bacterial cells. And so it's interesting then if you were to say petition a this is so I can't believe we're talking about this.
This is so chaotic.
If you were to petition like a colony of bacterial cells to go do something, energetically speaking, you have like millions of these cells that you've now charged or instructed to go carry out a particular task. Change that to like maybe working with bacteria in the ground, like this overall kind of microbiome. We're talking like millions of bacterial cells. So it'd be interesting to see if maybe there was like an energetic difference utilizing like all of this kind of this manpower, if you will. I don't know how to even talk about it, to kind of like send toward your intention and take it out to hopefully manifest.
Right. As someone who does a lot of gardening, now I attached a money spell to ginger. And now I'm thinking all of the things that are in that soil, especially since I do my own composting too. My brain's just like, whoa, that's, you could just get exponential in sort of that realm. But yeah, oh god, like doing your own composting could be a treasure trove of bacteria magic, because there's so many different things that are going into it and so many things happening.
It would be cool to then take, because I remember back in undergrad in my microbiology class, we actually like went outside and we had to get like a culture of dirt from the ground, or take something from a tree, whatever. I think I swabbed an acorn. And you then had to like swab it and plate it. It'd be really interesting if you were to take a swab of dirt, plate it, see what grows. You can identify it using, lots of different tests. Granted, you would need a laboratory for this, like just an aside. But if you were able to like identify exactly what microbes were in your soil sample, and then you could very specifically work with those to like do something, because every soil bacteria like typically has a purpose. Yeah, that'd be very interesting. I was also thinking if you could like maybe use bacteria for protection, like a kind of ward, right? Like there's so many in your soil. I feel like it would kind of make sense to utilize them as a type of ward or protection spell. I have no idea how you would do that. I'm just like throwing stuff out there in terms of thoughts that are popping up as we talk about it.
That's interesting too, because I'm thinking about offerings, right? So like I do libations, so like wine, and then oftentimes like some sort of food. And if the food is compostable, I'll put it in my compost. And then, but now the offering is also joining my compost and all the bacteria. And then also when I'm pouring wine on the ground, that area where the wine is falling is changing a little bit. The libation is literally affecting the bacteria.
I'm not to get too hippie, but like this is exactly how I feel about animism. I feel like everything is kind of interconnected, and bacteria, like microbes, are so neglected. Like they're such an important part of our ecosystem and how things are connected together, and we just don't see all those like chemicals and those shared resources passing from one to another. And I don't know, I just think they're a really neglected part of the witchy community. Like we depend on them for so many kind of traditional things like decay, the things that we focus on like necromancy. So yeah, I do think that they're kind of culturally maybe more important than we give them credit for. And yeah, certainly like plant growth, like you say, like we depend so much on mycorrhizal fungi for growth of certain plants, but it's just like completely neglected and not paid any attention to.
I feel like one could make the argument that people historically have worked with bacteria, they just didn't know that they were.
Yeah, if you're working with beer, like you're working with bacteria and yeast,
right?
Basically.
That's true. That's very true.
About, like when farmers take time off, so they'll like grow for a period of years, and then they'll like let their fields rest. I mean, part of the nutrient replenishing is due to the bacteria, the soil bacteria that are in the grounds. In a way, you're honoring the bacteria. Of giving them time to rest and recuperate before you continue planting to get a better harvest.
It's funny too, because I'm just thinking about my compost bin. We actually on Dapenon, that's when we add new compost, and we add a bunch of things to, well, not a bunch of things, but sometimes we'll, check its quality to see if we need to add more water. We've started adding this one thing, it's called like Miracal or something. It's supposed to help with the soil because our soil is horrible up here, just because New England is just terrible soil. Anyway, but we'll like sing and like spin the compost. And so it's funny because I feel like now that I'm thinking about it, we do, like, especially in my case, like me and my housemate tie a lot of things to our compost and our soil specifically, just because we work in the garden and we work with a lot of plant entities. So I think that's really funny. Or we're like, oh, we need this because we need to balance like this level in our compost. So that's kind of funny.
What deities would you associate with microbes? I specifically have given offerings to Hygeia
Yeah.
because of microbiology, but I don't know if there's anybody that you can think of specifically.
So we named our compost Boroborfora, I think is the name.
Is
It's
that the Hecate
basically,
epithet that means eater of filth?
yeah, the Hecate epithet that means like eater of dirt, eater of trash. Just because we started doing this on the Daepnon. And I viewed it as like a liminal space because I can't really leave offerings at a crossroad. So for those of you who don't know, on the Hecate's Daepnon, you leave scraps from your home, essentially, usually dirt. You're supposed to leave it at a crossroads, but I don't have anywhere that I can leave it. So I decided that the compost is kind of like a crossroads of things dead being turned new. So I would kind of associate, I guess, Hecate with that kind of compost or any sort of entity associated with the dying and rising.
Yeah, I don't really have a particular like deity in mind, but I would certainly think that anything that has to do with like rebirth maybe would be a pretty good fit for like a god of microbes, given like the high rate of like replication and then how quickly their life cycle is over. It's just like this constant, thing. I also like any god of agriculture probably I imagine would work well with microbes since many of them are out in nature too. Okay, let's move on. I feel like we could spend all episode just talking about this one. All right, the next one. Oh, this is interesting. Do spirits undergo evolution? I think we're talking like evolution is in kind of like more macro evolution or even micro evolution too. I mean, what do you think?
I mean, they don't have DNA. I mean, I assume. I guess I haven't sequenced a spirit. but,
Can you
um,
imagine?
but I mean, yeah, you can say that like because a lot of spirits are like passed down through folk tales and things, and so etymologically you can see evidence of evolution. Like often, people don't know this, but geneticists will often use family names and they'll also look at etymology of family names to kind of trace that back with families. So there's kind of an interconnectedness between cultural evolution and human evolution. So we don't really see why we couldn't apply that term in kind of a loose sense, not so much a biological sense, to spirits, because it's kind of all about the way that they're passed down and kind of thinking about them in like a relativistic way. So how they relate to humans and human folklore.
I am not a medium, and I would have to ask somebody who maybe is. But I also wonder if maybe spirits do change over time, as if they continue learning, even as an entity instead of like a physical being on Earth. I have heard people say that like their ancestors, when they like go back to work with them, the ancestors, I made so many mistakes back in my time doing X, Y, and Z. Like here are ways you can do better. And so in that way, I do think that they evolve over time. They maybe change over time. I don't necessarily do ancestor venerations. So I couldn't say one way or another. But I think that maybe is a way to look at that idea. Belle, what do you think?
I don't know. I'm of like two minds with this. I feel on one hand, yes, because we evolve, but then at the other hand, I don't think they evolve in any sort of physical or that kind of way. I mean, because yeah, they don't have DNA. To my knowledge, I just would be curious as to how they evolve. And you see this happen with deities, specifically how they sort of become syncretized or the ways of worshiping them change, right? Like Apollo and Paean used to be two separate deities. At least they're pretty sure, just based on the way that they're talked about in the Iliad. However, now pretty much, and pretty much by the time of classical Greece, Paean was an epithet of Apollo. So in some ways, I guess you could kind of look at that as evolution. They kind of evolved into being the same thing. Or like you see, is apotheosis just an evolution of a spirit into godhood? I don't know. I think perhaps some spirits stay the same, but others change as people change and culture changes.
I think that brings up another interesting point though, which is that even if culturally maybe like one deity becomes an epithet of another deity over time, is that reflected also on in the spiritual realm, or do they remain separate despite them being culturally similar on the physical plane? What do you think?
I guess that kind of like brings up that question of, do the deities evolve on their own, or they evolved because humans evolved them, Then, leads into the deeper theological question, chicken and the egg problem of, are there deities because there are people, or are the people because there are deities, kind of thing. So it's like, are they changing because culture is changing, or are they changing because they're changing? There's a lot of things in modern witchy circles where it's just go like directly against what a deity was, for example, but it's kind of like shared personal gnosis becomes verified gnosis in some ways. Is that kind of almost like an evolution? I don't know. And then do they remain separate, or are they same? Or it's like how I've seen people who worship Ariadne. Ariadne was the wife of Dionysus. And in some versions of myths, she's alive, but in most of them, she's dead. And some people work with her, but some people see her as the deceased wife of Dionysus. And so, or what did they actually get married? I don't remember. They were supposed to get married. And so is she both alive and dead? I don't know.
I kind of think of like personal gnosis as like a selective pressure. Stay with me here. So like if you have a single species and you imagine applying a selective pressure to one in one area, eventually over time that selective pressure is going to lead to unfit individuals dying off and certain traits evolving, and you're going to get speciation. That's a very basic and bad explanation of speciation, but basically I can think of a traditionalist sect. So there's no selective pressure there. They're keeping everything the same. That kind of our deity species, if you like, is staying the same. Whereas if we take a deity and we put them in another cultural setting, and then they're subjected to all the cultural pressures from that society, they're going to evolve. And so then we have two versions of this deity. Like they have a similar common ancestor. So the common ancestor is the same, but the two fragments of them now are different. So they're two different species. Does that make sense? It's kind of like a shitty analogy, but it's how I kind of like to relate it to evolution.
It's not a shitty analogy though, because that's kind of how I see deities. Except I use the terms like archetypes. So you have like a singular archetype, right? But the selective pressure is the tradition that archetype is like viewed in, and so it then becomes their own deity. So like the sun god, for instance, in Hellenism or in Greek mythology, it's Apollo, but in like in the Egyptian pantheon, it's Ra. Sorry, I might have gotten that wrong. Again, not like not a dating expert. She just gave me a big like head shake.
I'll expand on that when you're done.
Okay. Yeah, you have these archetypes, and then based on like cultural pressures, you then derive these deities that have the same kind of original basis that they had stemmed from, but they're different because of the traditions that they were brought into. Very interesting. Yeah. Okay, Phil, you can correct me on whatever I said.
But that's actually a really interesting point. So there's a huge point of contention in Hellenic circles because Apollo in classical Greece was never a sun god. It's only when we see his syncretism with Sol in the Roman period that we even start to see it. But it's really, really not until much, much later into the Common Era that we actually see Apollo associated with the sun. And a large part of that sort of exploded with the Renaissance because, I don't know, they just like hated Helios. There's so much Helios erasure. And so suddenly Apollo just became syncretized with the sun, even though in like none of the texts he's like not at all related. He has Phoebus Apollo, which means the shining one, essentially. But a lot of gods have that epithet, Phoebus or Phoebe, of being light bringer, but it's not necessarily inherently tied to the sun or the moon. So that's why things get really interesting, and I lie awake at night thinking about this sometimes because I'm like, Apollo has been so misrepresented by being a sun god, but part of me is just like, but is that sort of an evolution? Like, is that now that the deity is evolving to be a god of the sun? I don't know.
Also, yeah, like if we think of it in like a determinist way, like if I don't know, it depends on how determinist you are, but you could argue maybe that's how the deity wanted it to be. Like maybe they're just revealing more of themselves through this because they have power over the kind of cultural narrative, so they can reveal more of themselves to different people and they can control their own evolution. But I don't know. I think that's kind of very, very much depends on your own personal philosophy.
But also then begs the question then is like how accurate is our kind of depiction of them from the stories of mythology, right? Because if they, for example, in Norse mythology, I think it's a lot of the information that we get on the Norse deities comes from the Eddas, right? Eddas, I don't really know how to pronounce that. But like if you kind of remove those stories from it, what would we actually know about those deities? And that's not just Norse mythology. Like I think that comes into many different pantheons. Um, this is I think then that poses a question: is how accurate is our view of the deities that so many people actually worship? Are they separate from their stories, or they have autonomy in that way, or is their identity so heavily based on the mythology that was written by man?
This kind of comes down to like your hard versus soft polytheism debate, I reckon. I think we probably need a whole episode for this one because it's really interesting. But it's very, very much based on like your personal philosophy and how relativistic you think it is. So yeah, how relative you think deities are to kind of human stories, or whether you think that they are actual kind of solid, hard, defined beings that are sort of more unchangeable. My opinion is somewhere in the middle. I don't necessarily think I have a hard opinion on it, but it's definitely an interesting discussion.
Yeah, okay, we'll save that then for another episode. And go ahead and move on to the third one, which is if computers contain crystals, what are their correspondences? This is really interesting, actually. And I think it also plays into the whole discussion of like whether technology is legitimate when you use it in witchcraft. But I'm curious to hear your opinions.
We talk a lot about crystals having vibrations, or I say we talk about that like as a community that gets talked about a lot. And we'll probably get into another episode where we sort of discuss this idea and whether it has any merit. I think our consensus is generally no. Anyway, computers, however, do contain crystals which are sort of piezoelectric. And piezoelectricity is a really interesting phenomenon because basically what it refers to, and I'm going to use my very basic knowledge of A-level physics here, it's where when you compress a particular material and it basically deforms those atoms such that the electron configuration of those atoms causes them to flow in a different way. So you compress the crystal and effectively you get an electric current. And you can associate a frequency with that electric current, which you could term as a vibration. So in this specific instance, actually, you could argue that, yeah, they do have a vibration, but then how you relate that back to having a specific property is quite difficult. And also, this is going to be like very heavily modulated by the setting that they're in and the actual specific pressure that you apply. So I don't know that you could say it's necessarily inherent, because you're manipulating that in an electric circuit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and in a way also like crystals that are utilized in like computers and phone screens and stuff, they're also so heavily processed to be exactly like what's needed to give you kind of the best resolution. So then in that way, are they natural enough to like have kind of like inherent properties? In a way, I would say no, but I also think that because of kind of the new form they've taken on, they might actually have unique properties. I don't necessarily know what those would be. It would be interesting though to think about, maybe is it possible then to like charge the crystals that are like a part of like your phone screen in particular, maybe to do something? Or like let's say that you set a protective sigil as your phone screensaver, right? Would maybe charge just having that sigil on your reflected in your phone screen, which is really just like the reflection from the crystals, right? Over time, would that kind of lend its energy and be amplified in a way to be more powerful? I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's honestly why I don't totally discount tech magic. I know it can get kind of be a fun topic for people to dunk on, which makes sense because a lot of it is silly. But certain ones like that in particular, like charging a sigil on your phone, just because of the literal charging and power, and there are crystals in your phone and computer. So I think there can be something to that. I don't think you can do necessarily all the things that a lot of like tech magic says that you can do. I don't think emoji spells are anything. Sorry, just
We're not
gonna
even
lay
going to
that
talk
one
about
out there.
emojis. So I have such strong feelings about emoji spells.
But I think specifically, I don't see why you couldn't charge, like work with the stuff inside your phones and computers from that field. But as you were saying, Astra, about like if the crystals are natural, and then that begs the question is, when does something no longer, something that was like originally natural, when does it become no longer natural?
Yeah, what is the line of processing
Right.
where something loses all kind of.
Are essential oils natural? After the plant has been so distilled. I don't know. I think that's also another question, which is another reason why I don't like always totally discount some more modern magic methods, because it's like, well, at what point does this thing lose its power, I guess, is another thing people should think about.
Also leads into the topic of where does the power come from, right? Because if the power is coming from the objects themselves, then I think something can like lose its powers, sure. But I typically say that the power comes from you. I mean, the magician, like it is what you put into it, and no tool itself is enough for magic to take place. Yeah, very interesting. I might steal that whole sigil on the phone idea myself and like just try it and see if
Experiment
I
and report back.
yeah. Well, and then you also have like regarding tech magic, I know there's a website online where you can like create sigils that will do it for you. Have either of you messed around with it? I did like mess around with it a little bit. I didn't personally like it because I think that it detaches you from the process of the sigil making. And I think that's like a lot of where the sigil kind of gets its power from is the actual process of its design. That's something I didn't like about the sigil engine specifically was that I just felt like I was putting in my intention, like it magically appeared. I was like, that's great, super convenient, but I feel like it kind of like lost its touch a little bit.
Yeah, that's fair. I also didn't like it because I didn't like being able to control it.
No, I was just gonna say like a lot of the going back to what you were saying about where does the power come from, like I think a lot of the argument with people who work with crystals is that it's from vibrations. And so yeah, you can argue that the crystals and computers in some cases are literally performing vibrations because that's their function in an electric circuit. But whether or not that's functional and useful is quite difficult to define. And then you have to go into this kind of weird like woo field of people believing that like electromagnetic radiation can cause issues. And I just want to like dispel that because the WHO has investigated that really, really thoroughly and has found no issues with electromagnetic radiation. But yeah, it kind of goes into people believing that vibrations can like alter their health, which isn't very well defined. And I just think it kind of goes down like a weird route.
We have an episode coming up on vibrations and frequencies and the legitimacy of some of those claims. But from the little research that I've done so far, it's not very substantiated. But we'll go into detail with that later.
I feel like we could honestly do a whole episode on tech magic and computers and that idea, because I was just thinking about how some people I've seen have created like Minecraft altars, which like you're like literally building something. We often think of the internet as being kind of like out here in this amorphous cloud, but the internet is a very literal, tangible thing. If you Google internet underwater wires, you can see where the internet is. Like the internet is not just air. Like I think a lot of people see it as very intangible, but the internet is very physical. It's something a lot of people discount, but I think it's worth examining.
What do you think of the idea that like the internet is in and of itself its own egregore?
I've heard that before. I honestly don't know that much about thought forms or egregores, but I certainly see, or like I've seen people talk about like algorithms as egregores, which I honestly think makes a lot of sense because algorithms are like they scare me. Like I am not technophobic. I love technology. Everyone in my family is a computer person, but algorithms genuinely worry me because they can predict what you're going to want and what you're going to buy. And it doesn't scare me like, oh, the computers are taking over. It more scares me from a capitalism singularity standpoint.
Yeah, I think the idea of egregores being a key kind of component of the internet, even just the idea that like the internet is so negative, right? And like we constantly see that there's like all these ideas of like canceling people and ruining careers and all these really terrible things in a way. I kind of think it's because the internet is like its own egregore and people feed into it a lot of hatred, and that's why kind of we get that back from it. It would be a very interesting topic to I think explore if we did do a tech episode. Somebody add that to the outline. We do need to do this. Yeah, maybe look further into that. Algorithms are also really interesting, and I think kind of the scary thing for me about algorithms, this is getting off topic a little bit, but that's fine, is that like it's so easy to discriminate with them. And I have noticed specifically recently, like on a lot of major platforms, there's been quite a bit of like shadow banning of occult content, which has been really unfortunate and it is discriminatory. And it happens with POC people as well. Like it's a huge issue, the whole idea of algorithms. So I've also heard of people like, I don't know if any of you have seen this, but like sometimes you'll see posts on Twitter where it's the algorithm in the middle, like surrounded by a bunch of candle emojis to try and like promote yourself within the algorithm. I think that's a really kind of funny thing to do. I'd be really curious to see if it actually worked for those practitioners, if they did it seriously.
I mean, yeah, because the point of machine learning, just from like a programming perspective, so I do a lot of programming, took a course on machine learning, but a lot of it is like you teach the machine to learn for itself, essentially, which is where things can get kind of scary because computers are perfect. That's the thing. And like, I know that sounds weird to say. It's like whenever I was in coding classes, if like something wasn't working, everyone would blame the computer, and the professor's like, no, the computer's doing its job perfectly. It's just if you do one mistake, like it does it perfectly to the T. If you put in one mistake, it's not going to work because the computer follows everything to a T. It's never wrong. So I think that's where things could get really scary. And I could talk endlessly about how much I hate the algorithms and how I think they, promote people. They promote people tearing each other apart, and they're tools of the state to, prevent the unification of the people. But that's that's just where I stand.
All right. Well, we will dive into actually all of this, I think, a little bit more in that tech episode that we mentioned, because now that we've talked about it, I think we could definitely like make a full episode out of it for sure. All right. What's next on our list?
This one's for you.
So, what happens to planetary magic after the heat death of the universe? All right. I mean, to be totally honest, after the heat death of the universe, like we probably won't be alive, so do with that what you will. But it's interesting though, because I think if we go by the idea, the first law of thermodynamics, right, that energy is neither created or destroyed, it's simply transformed, then one could argue that the planetary energies are still there, they just aren't condensed into particular planets. And so this idea of as above, so below just might look a little bit differently. It's not to say that you can't still utilize planetary magic, you just might use different terminology for it, because that energy is still there, it just will be different. It's interesting. What do you think?
I guess to me, it kind of relates to this idea of like astrology and geocentrism, and because obviously like astrology is kind of geocentric. Is it kind of about the inherent nature of those, or is it about the kind of relational positioning of them? Does that make sense? Like, is it more about where they are and how they interact with one another? In which case, the geocentrism matters a lot, or is it like inherent to that sphere no matter what? So if you're swapped around Mars and Jupiter, ignore the devastating effects on gravity,
Mhm.
like would they still have the same effect, or is that a completely different system now because they're moving in different spheres?
That's interesting. I don't really base my like the planetary magic that I practice is definitely not really based upon like the astrological or yeah, like the astrological kind of verification, I guess, of their particular characteristics. Like it's much more on a spiritual level, and in that case, it would matter less. I'd be curious to hear maybe an astrologer's perspective and see if that does make a change specifically. Kind of because like Pluto, for instance, is, even though it's no longer considered a planet by NASA, like within the realm of astrology, Pluto is like the generational planet, so it kind of describes what's going to happen within a generation at a given period. And so if that was maybe moved closer to the sun or maybe to another planet, it would beg the question, like, would that maybe change its importance? Because we have like our individual planets, right? And then we also have like the generational ones. Like I think Uranus and Neptune also follow that same path. It would be interesting maybe if things changed, if that would also affect like the astrology of people in like future generations. I don't know. That's a very interesting question. I kind of wish Nike was
Yeah.
here or Cap was here so we could ask them.
I have a follow-up question that I was just thinking about. So let's say you're on the International Space Station. For some reason, people are living there, or Mars or wherever. It doesn't matter what planet it is, and you have a child. What does that mean for the,
Mm.
or like how would planetary magic look on the moon? Like if you're okay, this could be a very real thing. Like if a witchy astronaut goes to the moon or the International Space Station, what does planetary magic look like for them? I don't know. I think that's very interesting. It's weird to think about, but that very well could like a witch could go to the moon and do magic on it.
That's true. That is really interesting, actually, because I wonder if it would, because we like if we use the moon as an example, right? Like we see the moon, it rises and then it also sets just like the sun does, and it also goes through these cycles. Well, what happens if you like you were actually on the moon and you don't see this like cycle of rising and setting and you don't see the different phases? Does that, like, I don't know if you would still be able to experience those phases actually on the physical planet. You would think that it would actually probably maybe feel more intense since you're like on the planet, but at the same time I imagine it would feel much like you are just here on Earth, of course in different settings, because like you're in space and the moon is not Earth. But yeah, I wonder if you would feel the effect of those phases more strongly than you do here on Earth, or not. I don't know. That's a weird question.
I'm gonna tweet at NASA. I don't even have a Twitter. I'm gonna Twitter just for this. Actually, this would be really okay. So my aunt is actually, she worked for NASA. Now she's kind of into like this kind of realm of spirituality. So I might actually email her because she might have some really interesting thoughts as someone who specifically worked with like space and worked at
Yeah,
NASA
you
for a
should do it.
time.
That'd be super
Yeah, I'm
interesting.
gonna email my aunt. I think she might have some really interesting things, and I'll update everybody.
Kenny, what do you think?
I was just wondering, like, do you think because we are humans, at least as far as I know, we are like spirits of Earth, so inherently we are like tied to that, and so it's always going to be geocentric, and so like even if you're on the moon, it doesn't matter because we are like tied to Earth spiritually, and therefore, we would just follow whatever the is happening on Earth. Or does the location matter? Do
I mean,
you see what I mean?
didn't was it Carl Sagan who said that we're all made of stardust? Was that him who said that?
I think so.
So I mean, in that case, I mean, we are kind of made out of, the universe is all ultimately made out of materials that were once together and all in the same place. I think we're only tied to the earth because we have literally been tied to the earth since the dawn of humanity. So I don't know if that means that we're inherently have to work with the earth. Does magic work on the moon in that case?
Well, see, Kenny, that what you're saying there also then begs the question of like, if alternative life forms exist, so aliens, then man, I never thought I would talk about aliens on this podcast. Would their spirituality be super different from like ours because they wouldn't be tied necessarily to Earth, they'd be tied to whatever planet like they're from. Yeah, that's a weird thought. I don't know.
Well, their cultural norms presumably be very different as well. So, like,
Well, of course, yeah.
so yeah, but they probably would do. But I don't know if you could necessarily say what it was down to. I think it would be really interesting to see what the cultural norms of another population were and whether they did have any spirituality. That would kind of show whether it's an inherent thing or if it's just a human thing or something kind of in between.
Mm-hmm. Weird. That's making my mind go all kinds of places. Nobody has any more thoughts on that. We can move on to our next one, which is let's talk about whether or not you can do plant necromancy on your furniture. And I actually want to add to this and say because like our furniture is made out of like plant material, can you utilize that in spellwork for whatever you decide to do? Very, very curious to hear opinions on this.
I think I don't even. It's interesting. It's interesting. So, like right here, I have a recorder, and I play Renaissance recorder. They're usually made out of wood. This one I'm holding is actually Baroque, but whatever. That doesn't matter. It's a recorder, and it's made out of wood. Then I have another recorder here that is made out of plastic. And it's interesting because when people are building recorders, the plastic recorder will never, ever, ever, ever sound as good as the wooden one. And that's just the nature of like frequencies and humidity. Like this plastic one gets real yucky after like a few minutes just because there's no place for water to get absorbed. And I think there's something too where people just seem, and this is anecdotal evidence, so take that as what you will, but I have noticed that people seem to be more comfortable. They're like, oh, I like this because it's natural. Like I was just thinking, like I have a hairbrush that's plastic, and I was thinking, oh, I might want a wooden one because it's, I don't know, sometimes I brush my hair as a form of cleansing, and I'm like, oh, then it's more natural. So I feel like there's an inclination to use this, like use the wooden thing, even though it's, this plant is not alive, this tree is not literally living. But so I think there's something to that even once a plant has died and been transformed into something else, that we still feel some sort of connection to it. Now, if I can actually, I don't know, do necromancy with this dead hunk of tree here, I'm not sure. I don't know about that. But if one can do necromancy and one can work with plants, does it follow that one can do necromancy on plants?
I'm going to counterpoint this. So you've got your plastic recorder, right? And we kind of refer to the plastic as non-natural because it's a synthetic material. However, plastic is made of, it's made from oil, and oil is made from kind of decaying dinosaurs and plant carcasses and things like that, which have been transformed over millions of years by pressure and bacteria. So yeah, we're further removed from it, but it's still natural, just in a different way. Like Are we able to work with the the dead dinosaurs in your recorder?
So if I use my wooden recorder, I could connect it to the spirit of the tree. But if I use my plastic recorder, I could connect to the spirit of the dinosaurs.
In summary, use the plastic one.
Oh my gosh. I do to Bell's point, I do think that we have kind of innate connection to anything that is natural, because I know, like, when I go looking for apartments or places to live, I'm always drawn toward the old buildings that have like the original woodwork, and I really don't like super modern apartments or houses, because I feel detached from them. But like, for some reason, wood makes me feel much more at home. Whether that's because it's natural or not, I have no idea, but I think that there is something to that. What's interesting though, and this is what I was thinking about the other day, I was listening to an episode on a different podcast. I don't remember what it was called, but they mentioned that because our furniture is made out of plant material, even though, well, first of all, just because it's been transformed to something else, does that make it dead? That's one question. And then second of all, can you use that to kind of work with the spirit of your home? Like, collectively, everything in your home allegedly like works together to kind of become like a house spirit of sorts. And then can you work with that specifically to do things like protection or just making people feel more at home, and so on and so forth? So do all of the woods or natural products that your furniture is made out of contribute to kind of this like house spirit idea? What do you think of that?
I love the idea, actually. And I think maybe instruments, like Phil mentioned, are a good example, because different woods can add a different timbre, a different kind of quality to music. So that's kind of one example. And obviously, we have woods with different correspondences. So yeah, you could argue that that's the spirit of the plant still permeating through the wood. I quite like the idea of maybe the person who has made the furniture has maybe done that and worked with the spirit in kind of a devotional way. I think that would be the most authentic way. So maybe somebody like whittling a spoon out of walnut and like really spending time with the plant, spending time with the tree itself, to kind of understand what shape that spoon wants to be. I don't know if with furniture, if you just put it together, you might kind of get like a mishmash of things. So I don't know how you would kind of calibrate that unless you're really experienced with working with plant spirits. I don't know. It's an interesting idea. I think my thoughts are decidedly half baked on it.
It's one of those things where like homemade is it seems to almost always be better, because you, in this case, you could really work with whatever you're building, and you could make that connection, and then it would be stronger and more authentic. But even then, like, I have no carving or building skills whatsoever. I'm totally worthless in that area. So everything I buy would be like something from IKEA that I can put together quickly and easily. So then the question is like, does that make it less, or could you still work with it? I think you can. I think the idea of kind of having everything correspond to a house spirit is really interesting. And given that people have furniture that stays with them for such a long period of time, I also think it's interesting. Like, people say that if like a family member dies, right, and you have all the furniture, and people talk about like this like sentimental connection to said furniture. I mean, if it's with a person for such a long period of time, then in a way it does form a kind of bond with them. And so if you were to go through like a loved one's furniture after they passed, and like, I don't know, that it's very interesting, because like, people keep things because they're sentimental, and they feel like they will have a part of that person. And so it's like, over time, I think you do in a way build a connection with that material. Now, whether it's with a plant or the piece of furniture, that's maybe different. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's interesting, because there again, it comes back to the debate of, do you put the spirit of the plant or into the item, or is it inherent? And I think that's interesting what you said about furniture, or just like I love antique stores or thrift stores, because I personally feel like there is some sort of, I don't know, residual energy, some sort of something that is left behind from whoever had it, and like this experience that item had, I guess. So I don't know. I think there's something to that. And then it's like, well, are you working with the furniture? Are you working with the person who had the furniture, or some sort of like weird combination of both? I think there's something to that. It's like buildings can be haunted. I don't personally really believe in like physical, like actual visual manifestations of most spirits. I think a lot of it is more energetic. But there's definitely presences that can be felt. Like, I love going to old places. I mean, I work in the historical interpretation field. Like, I love there's something to, or like yesterday I discovered that there's just like an 18th, like a Revolutionary War grave just a mile from my house, and I went, and there was just like, you could there's something there.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so the next one. This is from a friend on one of the servers that we're all a part of. There is theoretically no reason why we can't connect to our evolutionary ancestors through ancestor work. What do you think about that?
I don't know, because I kind of laughed at this idea. It's like, oh, kind of going back to bacteria type thing, which I do actually kind of think it's a fun idea. But and then people were talking about it and talking about like early man and prehistoric societies and communities and how they related to one another. And actually, I thought maybe it had some legs. Like I thought maybe, yeah, it would be very difficult to understand them on more than a very base level. But it's kind of an interesting idea, and I don't really see a basis for why you couldn't. But I will preface that with or suffix that with the idea that I don't necessarily work with ancestors. So maybe I'm just completely misunderstanding the concept.
I mean, I think it's true. I mean, I added here, I said, does this mean I can work with cavemen and Neanderthals? I mean, and like, it sounds silly. Again, it goes back to like a lot of these things. It's like, well, you could make an argument for yes, you could, especially if you're looking at a lot of this under like a more chaos magic paradigm. A lot of that could make sense. Some of it, though, gets into why. Like, why would you do this? I don't know. I mean, I think if you are making an argument for, if you do ancestor work or ancestor veneration, ancestors can be, your own ancestors. There's also an argument to be made for ancestors of profession, etc., ancestors of place, ancestors of religion, culture, etc. So I don't see why you couldn't work with like Neanderthals or cavemen or even going back and like work with the I was watching what was I watching? I watched too many things today. Oh, it was Creature from the Black Lagoon, and it opens with them talking about the beginning of the earth, and they like show fish essentially, and I just went, oh, ancestor. Like, I don't know, like I guess you could, again though, I don't know why you would, but I think you could theoretically.
It's interesting, actually. I can think of a reason why you might do it, and that is to maybe rid yourself of some of the biases that we have from cultural and societal like influence, right? So maybe if you were to work with your ancestors to bring yourself back to maybe the true kind of focus of humanity, like what it was untainted. I think that could be an interesting and like a very interesting way to think about it. But that's also assuming that it was ever untainted, which I don't necessarily know is true. And like how far back does that go? I mean, when I don't know. I don't know. I don't necessarily know how you would go about doing that. But that is a thought that I had. I do think it's possible. I don't see why not. It's kind of also like determining ancestors, like how far back are we going, you know what I mean? Like, is it just a couple of generations? Are we looking at ancestors, from decades if not centuries ago? Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. The other one is though, is if we actually look at this in terms of like scientific evolution, if you're talking about like macroevolution, right, there is a common ancestor. Humans are a part of a larger tree of life, and we are connected to like other animals. And so then it's like, could you even go to that extreme and say you're working with like maybe our like ancestors evolutionarily, even as far back as the common ancestor? Like, what would that even look like? I have no idea. Don't ask me. I don't do ancestor work, but that is certainly another thought, another way you could take it, I suppose.
Just practically speaking, and I don't know if any of us actually do ancestor work necessarily, but practically speaking, do you need like a connection to an ancestor to like work with them? Like, for example, would you need like a photograph or a name or just an idea of like what they would look like or sound like? Or could you just kind of imagine like early man in general and then have a connection? Because I think that's the missing link for me. Like, how would you connect to them? Exactly. Like, how would you build that connection?
Right. So for me, like I do a little bit of like ancestor work. So I work with like two main things. I work with my very literal defined ancestors because I have stories of them. So some of them I actually have pictures of, but my grandfather and his father and my father were all like the family genealogists. So like I'm very lucky in which I have names and I have stories. So to me that is the connection to them. And also for me a lot of it is place as well. Another thing I've started working with since I started a new job is like trying to connect to the seamstresses of my area of New England, because there is actually a fairly deep history of disasters and also survival of seamstresses here or people who work in the textile industry. So in that way, it's like the physical land is what is connecting me to those people. So I honestly don't know what the connection would be. Maybe museums. Just go to museums and sit with a cave painting or something. Yeah, I guess that's a good point, is what is that connection? Is merely knowledge of their existence enough? For things that far back, I don't think knowledge of their existence is necessarily enough.
But I mean, they were human, right? So there is that connection.
Right.
If nothing else, the same basic needs for survival. I mean, all of that, like biologically, none of that would have changed, except for maybe some selective pressures over time, depending upon where you're living, of course. But
I'll go to the Harvard Natural History Museum and start communing with some of the rocks and let you know what comes up.
it actually makes me wonder, though, because Felicity, you mentioned, I have actually never thought about it like this, which is surprising, but whatever. The idea of like ancestor work within a particular discipline. So, like as a scientist, it's possible to maybe do ancestor work like those brilliant minds like Albert Einstein and Robert Bohr and Stephen Hawking and all of these incredible Pythagoras, like whoever, all these incredible scientists who made such revolutionary changes within our fields. Working with them, could you maybe get some kind of insight that current society is lacking? In fact, I think like Albert Einstein was probably one of the last kind of great scientist because he was one of the last people who really combined spirituality along with science. He did both. Unfortunately, a lot of people like to disregard his interest in the occult, but he certainly was. And in a couple of memoirs that have been written about him, there is brief mention of the fact that he held to hermetic ideals, and he was an alchemist in a very literal sense. And so it would be interesting to maybe do some like ancestor work with these very established, being people in our fields who've now passed away, but could offer maybe some lost insight into the world and how we see it.
Computer magic with Tesla. That's all. Get that electricity.
That'd be so cool. Can you imagine? That'd be awesome.
Oh my god, your computer would explode. Just explode on the
There is
shield.
actually a website. If you have a graduate degree and you have a supervisor, you can look yourself up on this website, and it gives you a family tree of your supervisors. So who your supervisor was, and who their supervisor was, and it kind of goes back as far as you can see. So you can kind of think of it as like an academic family, and you're like your own lineage in that way. But yeah, there's also a lot kind of a dodgy stuff there, because obviously you have to then think about there's also a lot of entrenched elitism there, and a lot of probably sexism too. So I would feel slightly strange about working with those lineages, because I would feel like quite disconnected from them in some ways. But it's definitely an interesting idea.
That's very cool. It's interesting. So there's this author, Austin Kleon. He's not a cult at all, but his books are very good. So shout out to him. But one of the things in his first book, Steal Like an Artist, that he mentions that has like stuck with me ever since, where I kind of came to my own conclusion about this idea of ancestors of profession. So he basically talks about building your own artistic family tree, or it could be any profession. So he says, write yourself and then 3 people who inspire you, and then go to those people and do 3 people that inspired them, and then sort of build this family tree of influence. And I think it's actually like, I did it when I read his book like years and years ago, and it was absolutely fascinating because it encourages you to not only just like look at these people and their lives, but to specifically look at who influenced them, and you make some like really surprising connections. And some of the most funny, some of my influences that I had written actually all influenced each other in this really interesting way. So I actually encourage people to do that if you're like an artist, or even I could see that working in the occult sphere as well, or any other profession, of writing who inspired you and then who inspired them, and going back and back and back as far as you want to. And I think that's a really interesting way to build this sort of family tree of influence.
I really like that idea. That's very interesting. It's something I haven't thought about ever doing before.
Yeah, I like that you have a bit more creative control over it as well. Like you don't have to be at the behest of the people who history chose to honor, but you can have a little bit more control over. Like, for example, we in the beginning of the episode we talked about Rosalind Franklin versus Watson and Crick, and we can kind of give people the respect they were due, which they might not have got at the time. So yeah, I think that's a really, really nice idea.
Okay, we will call that for our first episode of Witchy Shower Thoughts. But thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed kind of considering some of these things with us. If you have other spiritual shower thoughts that you've had that maybe you would like us to discuss, feel free to leave them on the Instagram post for this episode, or feel free to message our Instagram account, and we will include them in the next one. But I hope you enjoyed, and have a good day, everybody.